It was a Tuesday afternoon in August, the kind of afternoon that feels too quiet, too still, as if the air itself is holding its breath. Memphis, Tennessee, August 16th, 1977. The sun was brutal outside, pressing down on the city like a heavy hand. But inside Graceland, that legendary white-collar mansion on Elvis Presley Lane, the curtains were drawn, the lights were dim, and the world's biggest star hadn't been seen in hours. His girlfriend, Ginger Alden, woke up sometime after midday and noticed the bed beside her was empty. That wasn't unusual. Elvis kept strange hours. He wandered the house at night, read books in the dark, played piano when he couldn't sleep. But something felt different that afternoon. Something in the silence felt wrong. She called out his name. No answer. She walked down the hall toward the bathroom, that large, carpeted bathroom connected his private suite, and pushed open the door. What she found on the floor would stop time itself. Elvis Aaron Presley, the king of rock and roll, the man who had shaken the entire world with his hips, his voice, and his smile, was lying face down on the carpet, unresponsive. He was 42 years old. He was still wearing his pajamas. And he was gone. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics rushed in. They tried. They tried everything. But as they loaded him into the vehicle, those who were there, those who saw his face, saw his body, already knew. By the time they reached Baptist Memorial Hospital, the official time of death was called at 3:30 p.m. The king was dead. But here's the question that haunted the world then, and still haunts it now. Was it really over? Was it really that simple? Because the more you dig into final years of Elvis Presley's life, the more you pull back the curtain on what happened inside those walls, the more a terrifying picture begins to emerge. A picture of a man who was being failed by everyone around him. A man drowning in pills, in isolation, in betrayal. A man who had conquered the entire world, and yet had somehow lost control of his own life. The full truth about how Elvis died and why is darker than most people know, and it involves names, decisions, and hidden secrets that will make you question everything you thought you understood about the king. But before we get to that final, devastating day, we need to go back. We need to go back to the very beginning. Because to understand how a legend falls, you first have to understand how he was born. If you're new to this channel, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the story we are about to tell you is unlike anything you've heard before. It started in a small shotgun house in Tupelo, Mississippi, January 8, 1935. A cold winter morning. Gladys Presley, a young woman with deep dark eyes and an enormous heart, gave birth to twins. The first boy was named Jesse Guerin. He was stillborn. Silence filled the room before any celebration could begin. And then the second boy came, alive, screaming, fighting. They named him Elvis Aaron. From the very first breath of his life, Elvis Presley arrived into the world paired with death. That detail is not incidental. That moment, the loss of his twin brother, the shadow that followed his birth, shaped Elvis Presley in ways that psychiatrists and biographers have spent decades trying to fully understand. Elvis never forgot Jesse. He spoke about him throughout his life. He felt, in some profound and almost spiritual way, that he was living for two people, that he carried the ghost of his brother with him everywhere he went. And maybe that is part of why everything he did felt so enormous, so desperate, so hungry. The family was desperately poor. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, worked whatever jobs he could find. There were times when there was simply no food on the table. The family moved constantly, chasing work, chasing rent money, chasing something better. But through all of it, Gladys was the anchor. Gladys was the center of Elvis's entire universe. She walked him to school every single day. She waited for him every afternoon. She held him, loved him, worried over him with an intensity that bordered on obsession, and Elvis returned that love just as fiercely. That bond between Elvis and his mother would define him forever, and it would eventually become part of his destruction. The Presleys moved to Memphis in 1948, when Elvis was 13. They found a small apartment in a public housing project called Lauderdale Courts. And it was here, in this crowded, vibrant, racially mixed neighborhood on the edge of Memphis's musical heartbeat, that something began to stir inside a quiet, shy boy who no one yet knew to look at. Elvis was the kid who didn't quite fit in. He wore his hair long, when other boys wore it short. He wore pink and black when other boys wore blue and gray. He was different, and he knew it, and in the cruel social calculus of high school, different meant invisible. He didn't have many friends. He ate lunch alone sometimes. He carried his guitar to school in a worn case and played it quietly, almost secretly, as if the music was something too private, too sacred, to share just yet. But the music was already there. It had always been there. Growing up, Elvis had absorbed everything around him. The gospel music from the Assembly of God Church, where he would literally weep watching the choir sing. The blues pouring out of Beale Street. The country music crackling through the radio. He was, without knowing it, becoming a living vessel for every musical tradition the American South had ever produced. And when it came time to release all of that, the world would never be the same. In the summer of 1953, 18-year-old Elvis Presley walked into a small recording studio on Union Avenue called Sun Records. He paid $4 to record 2 songs as a gift for his mother. That was the official story, at least. But Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Records, heard something in that young man's voice that made him look up from whatever he was doing and pay attention. He didn't know exactly what it was yet, but he knew it was real. Sam Phillips had famously said that if he could find a white man who had the Negro sound and the Negro feel, he could make $1 billion. He was exaggerating, but only slightly, because what he was describing was a cultural earthquake waiting to happen. And Elvis Presley was a fault line. On the night of July 5th, 1954, Elvis was in the studio with guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black, working through songs that weren't quite working. The session was dragging. The magic wasn't coming. And then, during a break, Elvis picked up his guitar and started clowning around. He launched into That's All Right, a blues song by Arthur Crudup, playing it with a loose, wild, electrified joy. Scotty and Bill jumped in. Sam Phillips heard it from behind the glass and came running out. "What are you doing?" he asked. "We don't know," Elvis admitted, but they knew they needed to record immediately. When that record hit the radio in Memphis, the switchboard at WHBQ lit up like a thunderstorm. The DJ, Dewey Phillips, no relation Sam, played it over and over again because listeners simply would not stop calling in. People demanded to know, who was this? What was this? And there was genuine confusion, genuine shock, because nobody could place Elvis by sound alone. Was he black? Was he white? Was he from here? Was he from somewhere else entirely? He was from a place that had never existed before. He invented it. And from that moment in 1954, the rocket launched. What happened over the next 3 years was not just fame. It was a supernova. By 1956, Elvis Presley was the most talked about, most desired, most controversial human being on the face of the earth. Heartbreak Hotel went to number 1. Then Hound Dog. Then Don't Be Cruel. His appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show drew 60 million viewers, at a time when the entire U.S. population was around 168 million. 60 million people in one night, watching one young man from Memphis shake his hips and curl his lip and absolutely electrify the air around him. The cameras famously filmed him only from the waist up after his first appearance was deemed too provocative. The establishment was terrified of him. Ministers preached against him. Parents banned him from their homes. And teenagers everywhere, absolutely lost their minds with love for him. But here's what the cameras didn't show. Here's what most of the story leaves out. While Elvis was shaking stages and selling millions of records, there was a man standing just off stage in the shadows, counting every dollar. Colonel Tom Parker. And Colonel Tom Parker was, depending on who you ask, either the greatest manager in entertainment history or the anchor that eventually dragged Elvis to the bottom of the ocean. Parker, whose real name was Andreas Cornelis van Kijck, a Dutch immigrant who may have entered the United States illegally and almost certainly could never apply for a passport because of it, had latched onto Elvis in 1955 with a grip that would never loosen. He negotiated a deal that gave him an extraordinary cut of everything Elvis earned. At times, the Colonel was taking 50% of everything. Every concert, every record, every movie, every merchandise deal. 50 cents of every dollar Elvis made went to Tom Parker. And Parker's management decisions were, to say the very least, controversial, because of his own immigration concerns that were never publicly confirmed but widely believed. Parker could never take Elvis on an international tour. Elvis never performed outside of North America. Not once. In an era when the Beatles were conquering the globe, when the world was screaming for Elvis, he stayed home. He never toured Europe, never toured Asia, never performed in South America or Australia. The international adoration was enormous and untapped, and the man who claimed to be his greatest advocate was the reason it stayed that way. And then there were the movies. Parker pushed Elvis into Hollywood, and at first, it worked. Love Me Tender in 1956, Jailhouse Rock in 1957, King Creole in 1958, a film that even serious critics praised, a film where Elvis showed real dramatic potential, where you could see the edges of something genuinely powerful trying to emerge. And then Elvis was drafted into the U.S. Army. He served. He didn't run, didn't use his fame to get special treatment. He went to Germany, served his 2 years, kept his head down, and while he was gone, something happened that shattered him in a way that the world never fully understood. His mother got sick. Gladys Presley had been struggling with health problems for some time. She drank. She took prescription diet pills. She was overweight. But more than anything, she was lost without her son nearby. In August of 1958, while Elvis was still in the Army, Gladys suffered a heart attack. Elvis rushed home on emergency leave. And on August 14, 1958, just 2 years before he would be the most famous man in the world, Gladys Presley died at the age of 46. Elvis was inconsolable. People who were there described something breaking in him that night. He threw himself over a casket at the funeral home. He wept openly, without shame, calling out for her. "Oh, God, everything I have is gone," he reportedly said. Some who witnessed it said they had never seen grief so raw, so total, so frightening in its depth. The woman who had been the emotional center of his entire existence was gone, and a part of Elvis Presley went into the ground with her. If you've ever lost someone who was your whole world, you know what that does to a person. Leave a comment below and tell me, because this story is about more than just Elvis. It's about all of us. Elvis came back from the Army in 1960, and Colonel Parker steered him straight into the Hollywood machine. And this is where something slowly, quietly, painfully began to go wrong. The films were not King Creole. They were increasingly formulaic, lightweight, almost disposable. Blue Hawaii, girls, 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 fun in Acapulco. One after another, each one following roughly the same script. Elvis plays a handsome young man who sings, gets the girl, and resolves some minor conflict. The music in the films was catchy but thin. And Elvis, who had seen Brando and On the Waterfront, who had studied James Dean, who had real dramatic ambitions, felt increasingly suffocated. He wanted to do serious work. He lobbied for the lead in Midnight Cowboy. He wanted to do West Side Story. There were other serious film projects discussed, roles that might have changed his artistic legacy entirely. But Parker turned them down, repeatedly, because the formula was making money. The formula was safe. The formula was predictable. And safe and predictable were slowly killing Elvis's soul. By the mid-1960s, as the Beatles reinvented rock music, as Bob Dylan was changing what songs could say, as the entire counterculture was exploding with new energy and new art, Elvis was making his 27th mostly identical musical film. And the record-buying public noticed. His chart dominance faded. The critical conversation moved on without him. He knew it. He felt it. And the humiliation of it, for a man who had once been so far ahead of everyone else, was profound. But then came 1968, and what happened in 1968 was nothing short of miraculous. The NBC television special, The Comeback, the moment that reminded everyone, and perhaps reminded Elvis himself, exactly what he was capable of. The show was originally supposed to be a standard Christmas special. Parker wanted Elvis in a suit, singing holiday songs, safe and commercial. But producer Steve Binder had a different vision. And for once, the Colonel didn't get his way. Binder pushed for something raw, something real. He put Elvis in black leather. He sat him down in a round, surrounded by a small audience, with his old bandmates Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana and told him to just play. What came out of Elvis Presley that night was something almost supernatural. He was nervous beforehand, genuinely, physically nervous, shaking. It had been years since he performed live for a real audience. But the moment he plugged in, the moment the music started, something ancient and ferocious woke up inside him. He was electrifying. He was beautiful. He was dangerous again. He joked with the audience, improvised, played loose and wild and joyful. And when the cameras caught him in that moment, the world collectively caught its breath. The special aired in December 1968 and was the highest-rated program of the week. Critics were stunned. Fans wept. And Elvis, for perhaps the first time in years, felt like himself again. He followed it with one of the greatest albums of his career, from Elvis in Memphis in 1969, recorded in a new, stripped-back style. With soul influences and deep emotional honesty, the album produced Suspicious Minds, his first #1 single since 1962. It remains one of the greatest pop recordings ever made. The opening notes, the swelling orchestration, his voice climbing from tenderness to desperation. Even today, it stops you cold. Elvis Presley was back, and for a brief, shining moment, the future seemed wide open, and then, slowly, the walls began to close in again. The Las Vegas years. This is where the story gets darker. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what's coming next is a part that most documentaries skip over or soften beyond recognition. Starting in 1969, Elvis began a legendary residency at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. He performed over 1,000 shows in Vegas over the course of the 1970s. The shows were extraordinary. His voice was at its most powerful, his charisma undeniable, his band one of the tightest in the business. Audiences adored him. Shows sold out. He was paid enormous sums. But Las Vegas is a cage, however golden it might be. And the touring schedule that Parker and the hotel imposed was grueling beyond reason. 2 shows a night, night after night, week after week, month after month. Elvis was performing at a pace that would have broken most athletes, let alone a singer dealing with accumulating health problems and a deepening dependence on prescription medication. Because here's the truth that was hiding in plain sight through all of it. Elvis Presley had become severely dependent on prescription drugs. Not street drugs, prescription drugs. Medications prescribed by his personal physician, Dr. George Nichopoulos, known to everyone as Dr. Nick. The medications were many and varied. Amphetamines to wake up, barbiturates to sleep, painkillers for the chronic pain he experienced from injuries and medical conditions, steroids, tranquilizers. At various points, investigators later found, Dr. Nichopoulos was prescribing Elvis quantities of controlled substances that were staggering. In the final months of his life, the numbers were almost impossible to believe. After Elvis died, a Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners investigation found that Dr. Nichopoulos had prescribed Elvis over 10,000 doses of sedatives, amphetamines, and narcotics in the final 20 months of his life alone. Over 10,000 doses in less than 2 years. Let that number sit with you for a moment. Dr. Nichopoulos was eventually charged with overprescribing drugs to Elvis and others. He was acquitted. The defense argued successfully that he was trying to control Elvis's intake rather than enable it. But the medical and ethical questions surrounding that relationship have never been fully resolved. And to this day, there are people who believe that the medical care Elvis received in his final years represented a catastrophic failure, whether through negligence, through an inability to say no to a powerful man, or through something darker still. And Dr. Nichopoulos was not the only one who could see what was happening. People inside the Memphis Mafia, the group of old friends and employees who surrounded Elvis constantly, saw it too. Some of them tried, in their own limited ways, to help. Others enabled the behavior, because enabling it was easier, and because saying no to Elvis Presley was not something most people in his orbit had ever learned to do. He was the king. What the king wanted, the king received. The physical consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. By the mid-1970s, Elvis was struggling with his weight, a side effect of the medications, his sedentary lifestyle, and poor dietary habits. He wore specially designed jumpsuits on stage to accommodate his changing body. Some performances were luminous, transcendent, as breathtaking as anything he had ever done. Others were disturbing, Elvis slurring lyrics, losing track of songs, barely able to move, his eyes glazed and distant. Footage exists of these performances. Footage that, if you've never seen it, will make your chest tighten with something that feels very much like grief. Audiences didn't always know what to make of it. Some were confused. Some were worried. Some laughed nervously. Some simply refused to believe that the man in front of them was struggling. Because how could the king struggle? How could the greatest entertainer who ever lived be broken? But he was breaking in front of everyone. And not enough people in power did enough to stop it. There was something else happening inside Elvis during those years. Something beyond the physical. A spiritual unraveling. A psychological darkness that those close to him tried to explain and still struggled to fully articulate. He had always been a deeply spiritual man. He read constantly the Bible, books on religion and philosophy, mystical texts. He was searching for something. He'd grown up in the church, and faith had always been the bedrock beneath everything else. But in the 1970s, that searching took on an urgency, almost a desperation. He was looking for something to hold on to in the dark. He was also profoundly lonely. His marriage to Priscilla, the beautiful young woman he had met in Germany when she was just 14 and he was 24, who had waited for him, believed in him, married him in 1967, had ended in divorce in 1973. The separation was painful and complicated. They shared a daughter, Lisa Marie, born in 1968, who was a great love of Elvis's life. But the marriage had been strained for years by his absences, his controlling behavior, his inability to truly share himself, an inevitable weight of living in the shadow of a legend. When Priscilla left, Elvis was devastated. The divorce hit him harder than he ever fully let anyone see, and it deepened the isolation that had been growing around him for years. Because that's the paradox that lay at the heart of Elvis Presley's tragedy. He was, arguably, the most recognized human being on the planet during his lifetime. He could not walk down a street without being mobbed. He could not go to a grocery store, a movie theater, a park. He was surrounded at all times by people, managers, employees, hangers-on, bodyguards, yes men. And yet inside all of that noise, inside all of that attention and worship and adoration, Elvis Presley was profoundly, achingly alone. He couldn't trust people, not really. He never knew who liked him for himself and who liked him for what he represented. He couldn't have a normal conversation in a restaurant. He couldn't walk in the rain or sit in a coffee shop and watch the world go by. The simplest human pleasures, the ones the rest of us take for granted every single day, had been taken from him so completely that by the end, he lived mostly at night in a mansion, surrounded by people who were paid to be there. His closest friends, Red West, Sonny West, Dave Hebler, were let go in 1976 in around a cost-cutting order by Vernon Presley. They were fired without what they felt was adequate warning or compensation. And in response, they did something that exploded like a bomb in Elvis's world. They wrote a book, Elvis, What Happened? Published in August 1977. The book was the first to pull back the curtain on Elvis's prescription drug use, his erratic behavior, his inner turmoil. For the first time, the public got a glimpse of something other than the legend. Elvis was devastated by the book. Those were men he'd known for decades, men who'd grown up with him, men he'd trusted, and what he felt as their betrayal cut him to the bone. He was aware the book was coming out. He was reportedly terrified of what it would mean for his image, for his relationship with his fans, for everything he had built. Insiders say he was not sleeping, not eating properly, more isolated than ever. The book came out on August 1st, 1977. 15 days later, Elvis Presley was dead. Now we have to talk about what really killed Elvis Presley, because this is where the story gets complicated, and where the secrets press against the surface, demanding to be heard. The official medical examiner's report initially stated the cause of death as cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat, and Elvis did have serious heart disease. That much is medically documented. He also had a range of other health conditions, including an enlarged colon called megacolon, a liver condition, high blood pressure, glaucoma, and others. But there were 14 different drugs found in Elvis's system at the time of his death. 14. Among them were codeine at 10 times the therapeutic level, and significant quantities of other sedatives and depressants. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy, Dr. Jerry Francisco, listed cardiac arrhythmia as a primary cause and did not name drugs as a contributing factor. But other medical experts who reviewed the toxicology reports disagreed. Sharply, Dr. Noel Florendo and Dr. Eric Muirhead, both of whom were involved in aspects of the investigation, believed that the drug levels found in Elvis's system were significant enough to have contributed to, or even caused, his death. Several years later, a biographer obtained toxicology information suggesting that the drug combinations in Elvis's body were consistent with what is now called polypharmacy death, the deadly interaction of multiple sedative substances at high doses. The truth, as best as medical science can determine it today, is probably somewhere in this complicated middle ground. Elvis's heart was damaged and vulnerable. The drugs he had been taking for years, in excessive quantities, had damaged his organs and weakened his cardiovascular system. And on that August afternoon, a combination of factors, some physical, some pharmaceutical, some possibly to do with a specific drug dose taken that morning, pushed a fragile body past the point of return. But the real question, the question that should haunt everyone who knew Elvis, everyone who was responsible for his care, is not simply what killed him in that final hour. The real question is, why was he allowed to get to that point? Because the answer to that question points in uncomfortable directions. It points to a physician who prescribed extraordinary quantities of controlled substances to a patient who was clearly dependent on them. It points to a management structure that prioritized Elvis's productivity, his ability to perform, to sell records, to fill seats, over his health and his humanity. It points to the people around him who saw what was happening and either didn't know how to stop it or chose not to try. It points to an industry and a culture that worshiped Elvis as a product and sometimes forgot to see him as a person. And it points, perhaps most uncomfortably of all, to the loneliness and the grief and the unhealed wounds that Elvis carried from the very beginning. The loss of his twin brother, the poverty of his childhood, the death of his mother, the end of his marriage, wounds that never properly healed, that instead got buried under pills and performances and the desperate maintenance of a legend that had grown larger than any one man could sustain. There are those who still don't believe Elvis died that day. You've heard the theories. He faked his death to escape the pressure, the drugs, the spotlight. People claim to have seen him. Documentaries have been made. Books have been written. Let's be direct. There is no credible evidence that Elvis Presley survived August 16, 1977. The death was witnessed, documented, officially confirmed. The body was viewed by hundreds of thousands of people who filed past his open casket at Graceland. The funeral was one of the largest ever held in America. And those who knew him best, Priscilla, Lisa Marie, his father Vernon, never wavered in their acceptance of his death, no matter how much pain it caused them. But the persistence of those theories tells us something true, even if the theories themselves are false. They tell us that the world could not accept the idea that something so large, so alive, so impossibly vital could simply stop. That a man who had given so much to so many could have been failed so completely. That the system built around him, the management, the medicine, the machinery of fame, could have ground him down to nothing. It is easier to imagine that Elvis escaped. It is far harder to accept that he didn't. The death toll of Graceland that day reached far beyond Elvis himself. Vernon Presley, his father, never truly recovered. He died less than 2 years later, in 1979. The Memphis Mafia scattered. The Graceland staff mourned. And across the world, in cities and towns and small houses on quiet streets, people who had grown up with Elvis's voice, who had fallen in love with his records, who had carried his music through the hardest moments of their own lives, broke down and wept for a man they had never met. Because that was the thing about Elvis. That was the thing that made him different from every other performer who has ever lived. The connection he created was not professional. It was not commercial. It was personal, intimate, almost sacred. When Elvis sang, truly sang, from whatever place of fire and grief and joy he drew from, you felt like he was singing directly to you, like he knew exactly what you were feeling and had found the precise sequence of notes and words to meet you there. That gift is extraordinarily rare. It may never come again. And if you felt that, if you grew up with music or discovered it later and felt that electric personal connection, Then comment below. Tell me which song. Tell me when you first heard it. Tell me what it did to you. Because this story is yours as much as it is his. The legacy of Elvis Presley in the decades since his death has been complicated, contested, and, in some important ways, still unresolved. On one hand, the cultural impact is simply undeniable. Before Elvis, there was popular music. After Elvis, there was rock and roll, and eventually everything that came from it, which means almost every strand of contemporary music in existence today passes through Elvis Presley at some point in its lineage. The Beatles acknowledged it. Bob Dylan acknowledged it. Bono acknowledged it. Bruce Springsteen stood outside Graceland in the middle of the night in 1976 and climbed over the wall trying to meet him and was turned away. Every major artist who followed him has, in one way or another, bowed toward Memphis. He also deserves credit for something that his era made dangerous and uncomfortable, and which history has sometimes been careless about acknowledging. Elvis Presley loved black music. He grew up in black America's sonic world. He worshipped Arthur Crudup, Fats Domino, Little Richard, B.B. King. He credited them. He visited B.B. King in his dressing room. He wept in church listening to black gospel quartets. He was not simply appropriating a culture. He was genuinely, deeply, reverently connected to it. Does that mean the conversation about race and early rock and roll is simple? No, it is not simple. Black artists who created the music he drew from were often paid less, promoted less, and received far less of the wealth and recognition that their artistry deserved. That is a real and important part of the story that must be told honestly, without flinching. But it is also true that Elvis himself, the man, not the myth, was something rarer and more complicated than the simple villain that easy revisionism sometimes makes him. He gave away money constantly, to strangers, to fans, to anyone he felt needed it. He bought cars for people he barely knew. He funded charitable causes quietly, without announcement. He was, by most accounts from those who actually knew him, a kind man, a gentle man, a man who carried his faith seriously and tried, however imperfectly, to live by it. A man who loved his daughter with everything he had and who, even in the fog of his final years, lit up completely when Lisa Marie walked into the room. He was also a man who was controlled in ways he often couldn't resist. A man who found it almost impossible to say no to the Colonel, to the handlers, to the fans, to the mythology that had been built around him since he was 20 years old. A man who consumed prescription drugs at a rate that should have alarmed every medical professional in his life. A man who, by many accounts, told people in his final months that he was exhausted, that he was tired, that he didn't know how much longer he could keep going. Did he know the end was coming? Did he feel it? Some who were close to him believe he did. In the days before his death, Elvis had been preparing for a new concert tour. He was scheduled to leave Graceland on the night of August 16th, the very night his body was found, for a show in Portland, Maine. He had seen his dentist that day. He had spent time with Ginger. He had, by several accounts, spoken on the phone with friends and seemed, in some moments, almost at peace. But the body tells its own story. And the body of Elvis Presley in those final days was telling a story of profound, accumulated damage. The last photographs taken of Elvis, on a night not long before his death, as he arrived at an airport, are some of the most heartbreaking images ever taken of a celebrity. He is barely recognizable as a young man who had once stood on a stage in black leather and commanded the room with a single glance. He is heavy, pale, exhausted looking. His eyes are clouded. He is wearing oversized clothing and sunglasses at night. He looks like a man carrying a weight that no amount of help could lift. And yet, and this is what destroys you if you let it, there are recordings from those final concerts that are extraordinary. Moments where, in the middle of everything, in the middle of all the damage and the pain and the fog, Elvis Presley opens his mouth and something incredible comes out. The voice somehow is still there, still reaching for something, still trying. He never stopped trying. That, perhaps, is both his tragedy and his triumph. On the night of August 16th, 1977, as the sun went down over Memphis and the temperature finally began to drop, the world changed without knowing it yet. People went about their evenings. Children played outside. Couples ate dinner. Songs played on the radio. Maybe even his songs played on the radio, drifting out of open windows into the summer dark. And in a hospital across town, Vernon Presley was given the worst news a father can receive. The announcement went out to the world through news bulletins, breaking into regular programming with a gravity that the television anchors visibly struggled to contain. Walter Cronkite reported it. The BBC interrupted their evening broadcast. In Times Square, people stopped walking and stood still. In Memphis, cars pulled over on the side of the road. Women collapsed in the street. Men who said they would never cry, cried. The phone lines in Memphis were overwhelmed. Flowers began arriving at Graceland within hours. Thousands of bouquets, then tens of thousands, until the gates and the fence and the driveway were buried under blossoms. The crowd outside Graceland swelled to the night, standing in the August heat, candles in hand, singing a song softly in the dark. 80,000 people are estimated to have filed past his casket in the 2 days before the funeral. The heat that week in Memphis was brutal. Over 100 degrees. People stood in line for hours, sweating and silent, to pay their respects. Several people died of heat stroke in the line. Even at the end, Elvis Presley was drawing the largest crowds anyone had ever seen. He was buried initially at Forest Hill Cemetery, near his mother. Shortly after, both were moved to the meditation garden on the Graceland property, where they rest today. Millions of people visit that garden every year. They stand quietly over that simple grave marker. They leave flowers, scarves, notes, photographs, and many of them cry. People who were born decades after he died, people who only know his voice from old recordings, people who found in their own way at their own time. They cry for a man they never met. That is his legacy. That is what he left behind, in the end. Not the movies or the contracts or the business deals. Not the Vegas residencies or the merchandise or the platinum records. Not even the historic Cultural Revolution he ignited in 1954. What Elvis Presley left behind was something that technology cannot replicate, and commerce cannot manufacture, and time cannot erode. He left the feeling of being heard, the feeling of being understood, the feeling that someone out there in the darkness had found the exact sound of your own longing and was singing it back to you with everything they had. That's what he gave. That's what they couldn't take from him, no matter what else they took. Like this video if the story moved you, because sharing it is a way of saying that what happened to Elvis matters, that the truth matters, that remembering him honestly, not just as a legend, but as a human being, matters. And yet, and here is where we must end, in the place that is most uncomfortable, most necessary to sit in. The story of Elvis Presley is also a story about what we do to the people we claim to love. We take what we love and we consume it. We demand more than any one person can give. We build them into something inhuman, a symbol, an icon, a brand. And then we are shocked and wounded, and we feel somehow betrayed when the person inside the symbol turns out to have limits like the rest of us. We surround them with people who cannot say no, who profit from their excesses, who have too much to lose by telling the truth. We watch them break, slowly and then all at once, and we find reasons to look away until we can't anymore. This happened to Elvis. It has happened to others before him and since, and it will happen again. The prescriptions that killed him were legal. The physician who wrote them had a medical license. The concerts that ran him into the ground were profitable. The management that kept him working past the point of human endurance were doing, in their own minds, what they were paid to do. No one pulled the trigger. No one poured the pills down his throat. And yet, when you add it all up, when you look at every decision that was made in the final decade of Elvis Presley's life, you are left with the unmistakable feeling that an entire system failed him, that the people who were supposed to protect him were, one by one, nowhere to be found. He was 42 years old. 42 years old, with a daughter he adored, a voice that had not yet fully diminished, and somewhere, perhaps, under all the layers of damage and isolation and pharmaceutical fog, a soul that was still searching, still reaching, still, improbably, trying to sing. What might he have made if he had lived? What might those final decades have looked like? Another comeback? A new kind of music? Perhaps a return to the simple, raw power of that first recording session in 1954, when a shy kid from Memphis walked into a room and changed the world with nothing but a guitar and a voice that didn't know it was about to become eternal. We'll never know. And that not knowing is one of the great open wounds of American cultural history. Elvis Aaron Presley was born into loss and lived his entire life reaching for something he couldn't quite name. He gave everything, his youth, his privacy, his health, his body, his peace, to a world that loved him fiercely and protected him poorly. He died alone on a bathroom floor in a mansion he could never really leave. And the music he made, the electricity he generated, the impossible, unexplainable feeling he created in rooms and stadiums and living rooms and cars and broken hearts across the entire planet, that survives. It will always survive. But the man himself was only human. And that, in the end, is the saddest truth of all. If the king could not save himself, if the greatest entertainer who ever lived, surrounded by doctors and managers and fans and employees and the machinery of the entire entertainment industry, could still fall through the cracks, then what does that tell us about how we treat the people we say we love? That is the question Elvis Presley left behind, the one no one has fully answered yet. And somewhere tonight, in a quiet room, maybe on the other side of the world from Memphis, someone is putting on In the Ghetto, or Always on My Mind, or Can't Help Falling in Love, and feeling, for a few minutes, exactly what Elvis wanted them to feel, exactly what he spent his whole life trying to give. And maybe that's enough. And maybe it isn't. And maybe the fact that we're still asking that question, 50 years after they carried him out of Graceland, is the most powerful thing he ever did. The king is dead, and he never really left. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which Elvis song makes you feel the most. Let's remember him together.